Welcome to the Freelancer. Today we are going to talk about control flow in our code with conditionals and loops. In this lesson we will cover if statements, case and switch statements, for statements, for each statements, while and do-while statements, nested loops, some things you should avoid when writing loops, and tertiary operators. Now let's dive into it. In the previous lesson we saw what a variable was and that we can use it to store state in our application. Now in this lesson we will put those variables to good use by altering the flow of our code with them. Altering the flow in our application can be done in several ways dependent on which generation of programming language you are in. In C# you have the following. You have choice control flow if you want to skip over certain code. The if and the switch case statements fall under choice control flow. These statements allow you to execute a certain block of code when a certain condition is met. Then we have loop control flow for if you want to execute a block of code multiple times. The for each, while and do-while statements are loop control flow statements. These statements allow us to execute a certain block of code multiple times dependent on a loop condition. And then you also have recursion, which we will cover in the next lesson when we talk about methods. The first statement we will examine is the if statement. When we want to make decisions in our code, we will use the if statement. The syntax is as followed. We write if, and then between parentheses, we write the statement that we will evaluate. When the statement between our parentheses is true, we will execute the code in our if statement between the curly braces. We can omit the curly braces when we only have one statement that we want to execute, but generally this is a bad idea and makes our code less readable, so it should be avoided. If we write an else block, which is optional, we can also execute some code when the statement between our parentheses is false. A statement we can evaluate has to result in a boolean. A boolean is a type that is either true or false. The next choice control statement is the switch case statement. This statement differs from the if statement in the way that we can define multiple values that we want to check our expression against and define a code path for each selection. The syntax is as followed. You first write the switch keyword with the expression or variable that you want to test against. Then for each value you want to specify the code for, you write the case keyword with the constant value next to it. At the end of your case statement, you must write a return or break statement to jump out of the case. If no such return or break statement is specified, your compiler will give you an error. Each case statement must be unique. You can't define multiple case statements with the same value. If you want to execute one block of code for multiple values, then we can define multiple cases under each other and execute the code. Since C#7, instead of defining a constant value in each case block, we can use a pattern to match our expression against. I covered this in a separate video. The first loop we will examine is the for loop. We use the for loop for when we want to loop an exact number of times. Say for example, we want to print a message 5 times, we can use the for loop. The syntax for the for loop is as so. First we initialize the loop variable. This variable will keep count of how many times we are looping. And second we will tell the condition for which we still want to loop. And last is our increment or decrement statement that will change our loop variable. So if we want to print our message 5 times, we need to first declare an integer value, then tell the loop that we want to exit the loop once the variable reaches 5. And then tell it to increment our variable with 1 every time a loop has occurred. Next up is our for each loop. This loop is somewhat the same as our for loop, as in we know exactly how many times we will loop, yet the for loop is used for when we want to loop through each item of a list. The syntax is as followed. We declare a variable of the type that is in our list, and then we use the in keyword to tell the for each loop from which list we will want to read the items. The list next to the in keyword needs to be an enumerator, which we will cover in a future video. For the for each loop and the for loop, we have 2 special keywords. At any time we can exit our loop using the break keyword. If we don't want to exit our loop, but we want to jump to the next iteration, then we can use the continue keyword. The next loop we will cover is the while loop. We use this loop for when we want to use a custom exit condition. The syntax is like so. We write while, and then between parentheses, we write the condition that must be true for us to continue the loop. If the condition was false before we even started the loop, then we will not execute the loop at all. If we want to at least execute a loop once before we evaluate the exit condition, then you should use the do while loop. The syntax is almost the same, but first we write do and the while keyword with the exit condition moves to the end of the loop. This is useful for if the condition cannot be evaluated without at least one loop. In the while and the do while loop, we can also use the break and continue keywords to exit the loop or skip a loop. In this example, we can see a simple game of cards called 21. This loop needs to be executed at least once because the game needs at least one card to be drawn. We will then add the current card to our total, and if our total is not above 21, we will continue drawing a card. No winners in this game though. Of course, we can also nest loops. For example, if you want to print a rectangular grid of some sort, we could use 2 for loops to do this, like in this example. We declare a maximum x and a maximum y value, and then we use the for loops to print our grid. One sort of control flow statement that is very similar to the if statement is the tertiary operator. If we want to assign something to our variable, depending on a condition, instead of using the bloated syntax of an if statement, we can use the tertiary operator. To use the tertiary operator, we first define a condition, then after the question mark, we define the value we want to use when the statement is true. After the colon, we define the value that we want to use if the statement is false. Okay, so now that we saw all of these control flow statements, let's talk about some stuff that you should and shouldn't do with your loops and conditionals. First off, always write your curly braces, especially when you use multiple control flow statements through each other. Take a look at the following example. What is the code that will be executed when the variables some condition is true and some number equals 5? Try not cheating and drop me a comment with your expected outcome. A good developer always tries to keep his code as readable as possible. Just remember this, always code as if the guy who ends up maintaining your code is a violent psychopath that knows where you live. Okay, so the next code smell you should try to avoid is the break keyword. We should always try to exit the loop by exiting it through the exit condition that is defined in the loop. For a for loop, this is the loop variable that reaches the limit defined in its condition, and for a while loop, this is the exit condition specified next to the while statement. This is not always true, but the break keyword should only be used in the most rare cases. Another bad practice you should try to avoid is to manipulate your for loop variable within your loop. This might cause confusion in your code and makes it harder to maintain and read your code. For example, in this example, I am inadvertently creating an infinite loop. Also remember, when you try to manipulate the list in your for each loop, then you will change your enumerator, which will cause an exception. Use your loop as they are intended. Don't start writing strange loop just because you can. If you want an infinite loop, for example, which do you think is the most readable? The for or the while true? Both will compile to the same code, yet one is much more readable than the other. Also, don't misuse the tertiary operator. You can chain multiple tertiary operators together, but this becomes very hard to read very fast. Okay, something I avoided. In software development, we also have go-to statements. I deliberately left it out of this tutorial because you should never use this in your code. If there is one sure good way to ruin the readability of your code, it's with the go-to statement. So that was it. I hope you enjoyed it. So drop me a like and be sure to comment for further questions. I'll see you in the next video.